Hello everyone, and welcome to this audio podcast. This audio podcast as part of the Squeal and Squark. This audio podcast is part of the Hella Squad. This audio podcast is part of the Ship Mode Unit. This audio podcast as part of a ZtormLabostix production. So, as part of this audio podcast series, another question. Another question is is every sample or specimen is a person or a patient waiting for an answer, in around their specimen analyses. What specific moment reminds you of the human impact, behind the data, behind the data? So, in response to this question, is quite an intriguing one, because since in laboratory medicine or pathology, there is this basis where, for example, where 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 a patient or a healthcare service user may have, for example, a blood test or blood investigation, but alongside with that blood investigation, it may be where the patient or healthcare service user has an additional a laboratory investigation as well. So one patient or healthcare service user can potentially have several specimens put forward by a healthcare physician on the front line, in around to help firstly screen particular healthcare conditions, but also in around as part of forming a diagnosis. So every sample, every specimen that comes through the laboratory. Every specimen that comes through the laboratory is pertinent to the healthcare science workforce, in informing the answers in around a diagnosis, in around particular conditions, particular aspects pertaining to healthcare or healthcare conditions, so on and so forth. So at the same time, in as part of this, um, every healthcare, every scientist, within the laboratory environs, will have a different, will have a sort of a different sort of perspective, or basis, but in around this. But one of the mutual things is that is that although such healthcare professionals are not really patient facing healthcare professionals. So unfortunately, healthcare scientists, as good as they are in, or as good as they are in context of being those healthcare professionals in forming diagnoses, and forming sort of forming sort of forming answers in around particular clinical diagnoses, and in around particular syndromes that healthcare professionals put forward along with specimens. Healthcare professionals from the sciences um, are not not traditionally patient-facing healthcare professionals, and and therefore um, therefore therefore uh, although such healthcare professionals don't sort of immerse themselves in actual patient care in context of face to face. For example, then that although at the same time, there are those healthcare professionals that actually every specimen that comes through the laboratory doors is where every healthcare professional from the workforce, from the science workforce, does absolutely everything they can to ensure that the healthcare that patients that healthcare that patients have or go through are are and ha are taken firstly taken care of, but also ensure that that the analyses are analyses that are done that actually is and helps clinicians on the front in context of frontline practices, clinicians and nurses, for example, specialist nurses and frontline practices, to actually ensure that they can convey the applicable information to patients in real time. And so every specimen that goes through the laboratory, for example, whether it's a for example a full blood count, whether it's a an investigation for urine in around urinalysis, whether it's a clotting investigation, a blood clotting investigation, whether it's a hemoglobinopathy investigation, whether it's a follow up on where for example a patient may have a particular condition, and a clinician may want, for example, additional analyses. For example, then the science workforce is that professional healthcare workforce that actually works 24/7 in around ensuring that patient care can be and is delivered to ensure patients can get that patients or healthcare service users get the best out of their healthcare. So for every specimen that comes through the laboratory doors, there is a set of data and analyses that actually constantly reminds our healthcare professionals within the sciences in around that the analyses aligned to a patient's pathophysiology and in around their syndromes. So the analyses where there's, for example, that reminder in context of the analyses that are done on different specimens that come through the laboratory, also reminds such professionals in around the impact that their decisions can make in around their decisions that they make to ensure that patients or healthcare service users get the best out of their healthcare. So in that context, in line to that, there are some specialties, for example, within the sciences, which are really collaborative. Where, for example, you'll have healthcare professionals within the sciences, although they don't see patients, or although they don't see patients or are not patient facing, they actually form part of multidisciplinary teams, or MDT working, or multidisciplinary team working, where in sort of a sort of a mutual and joint sort of a collaborative way, that they actually have in some divisions within the sciences, there are those that they have MDT sort of meetings or collaborative efforts between frontline professionals or frontline healthcare professionals, in particular divisions of clinical practices, and where where they discuss or there's a where they form sort of collaborative efforts to discuss in around the different cases of particular in around particular healthcare service users or patients, and in particularly in around complex cases. So to give a basic example in around this, and in context of the human impact behind the data. One of the conditions that one of the healthcare conditions, which is a really quite a devastating condition, in context where it crosses in around it crosses in between hematology, microbiology, and in context of coagulopathy as well. So this particular condition is something that's referred to as hemolytic uremic syndrome, and the condition, because it crosses or traverses between different specialties, at least in context of the blood sciences, it is primarily a condition, at least in from a clinical practice point of view, it is a condition that affects that historically affects that has affected or cases or where incidences and prevalences are concerned in around those young people, children, young people who can suffer with primarily with a form of E. coli infection, and that actually from a form of E. coli infection that actually affects the kidneys, and basically in context of the way that infection infects their kidneys, it actually causes issues in actual aspects of those in around those where the syndrome in around the condition affects the clotting or what's known as the clotting cascade in around patients who are screened or diagnosed, and affects their generic hematology, but mainly in around where they that also affects, sorry, the generic full blood count, but also in around their conditions in around in around the urinalysis as well. So it's a syndrome that traverses in around three main sort of divisions, or three main sort of divisions, or of and in around in around blood sciences. And it affects because of its effects, sorry, it has patients or healthcare service users who suffer with hemolytic uremic syndrome. It actually is a condition that affects a patient's sort of general pathophysiology their whole life, and so it is a devastating sort of condition, and it has a serious human impact. There's a serious human impact behind the data, because of how patients, once they're diagnosed with this particular condition, they can have various clinicians can form particular care plans, for example. But a patient who goes through this particular condition, for example, may not have, may not be able to live a full life, for example. So it is a sort of devastating conditions. That being said, in more recent times, there has been literature to inform of some of the sort of new sort of pharmacotherapies that are available to treat and form in around forming the sort of care plans for those who have hemolytic uremic syndrome. But it has a devastating impact. I mentioned in around the three different aspects of laboratory medicine that are mainly sort of where hemolytic uremic syndrome has its place or has its basis, but there is a fourth, and that is actually in around transfusion, in around transfusion or blood transfusion as well, or transfusion laboratory practices, because the symptomology or pathophysiology of uremic syndrome actually causes challenges in as per mentioned in blood clotting, and in some of the pharmacotherapies or some of the pharmacotherapies or some of the treatments that have been sort of used in cases historically, is in around and the use of blood transfusion. But in around blood transfusion, in some cases, it can affect patients or healthcare service users where it does more harm than good. So that's one of the sort of challenges in around this particular condition, again referred to as hemolytic uremic syndrome. So there is an impact in around those who are formally diagnosed with this particular condition. And there are other, for example, other hematological conditions and other sort of microbiological conditions, and for example, in around sort of biochemistry, biochemistry sort of focused conditions, and in around immunobiology, for example, sort of conditions as well. So each specimen that comes through or enters through the laboratory environment, has a potential where it can change the way sort of healthcare service or patients or healthcare service users sort of have aspects of their healthcare, have aspects of their healthcare, and how they are in context of their general in around their lives. So yes, every sample, every specimen that comes through, it relates to an actual patient or a healthcare service user. So that is from a science standpoint or scientific standpoint. It's important that this is sort of appreciated, because the healthcare science workforce, again, isn't a patient-facing workforce, and yet the majority of diagnoses or screening of patient or healthcare and around healthcare services is where it starts off, or pretty much starts off or begins with, where a frontline professional or healthcare professional would request a patient, would request a specimen to be analyzed to attain an understanding of, for example, where the pathophysiology of a patient care, or sorry, in around where the patient's healthcare should be on how they can, and how healthcare professionals can form sort of better understandings in around the diagnoses that they make and form. So yes, it's important that that um, uh, that that is sort of understood or appreciated, and every moment that any healthcare professional in the sciences that they have and when they have specimens that come through the labs, through the laboratory, will all say that every moment reminds them, is a reminder that the specimen relates back to a patient. So on that basis, on that basis, um, uh, on that basis, there's always an impact that needs to be better understood, by both actually frontline healthcare professionals as well as those working across different laboratory divisions, but at least in context of how healthcare services can be better for everyone. So that draws this audio podcast to a close. This audio podcast is part of the Squeal N Squark. This audio podcast is part of the Hala Squad. This audio podcast is part of the Ship Mode Unit. This audio podcast as part of a ZtormLabostix production.